welcome back to my haunted library. It's Regina. I am finally adding a new video to my playlist for Robert McKee's story. I'm slowly working my way through this book. It's been like a year ongoing process, but I don't know if that's such a bad way of absorbing this material. This is about the third time I've read this book, and this time I'm really taking my time, obviously, spending a couple months off between each chapter. So now I'm on chapter 13, Crisis, Climax, and Resolution. This is the last chapter in part 3, the principles of story design. A lot of dense material there, a lot to get through, and this one is kind of a short chapter, and let's get started. Crisis, climax, resolution. I think we've all remember in English class looking at that chart that would always make the kids giggle because it's like, we're building to the climax, and you know, when you're in 8th grade, everyone's like, yeah, climax. But yeah, I mean, it is kind of a way of looking at it. Everything builds, the tension builds, boom, and then there is this falling action into a resolution. So, but he identifies something called the crisis, which is an interesting concept. Crisis, it means decision. So a decision has to be made, an irreparable decision that's going to propel the protagonist to the final confrontation, the final countdown. The crisis with the capital C is the ultimate decision. The protagonist's quest has carried him through the progressive complications until he's exhausted all actions to achieve his desire save one. He now finds himself at the end of the line. His next action is his last. No tomorrow, no second chance. This moment of dangerous opportunity is the point of greatest tension in the story, as both protagonist and audience sense that the question, how will this turn out, will be answered out of the next action. I think we've all seen movies where this moment in time is really important and we're totally with the character. And that's how it should be in a novel as well. I mean, not quite maybe as laid out this way because, you know, novels can take on lots of different forms, but this is a basic principle. The crisis must be true dilemma, a choice between irreconcilable goods, the lesser of two evils, or the two at once that places the protagonist under the maximum pressure of his life. How the protagonist chooses here gives us the most penetrating view of his deep character, the ultimate expression of his humanity. And I think that's really important to remember. It really shows one's true colors. Like, for example, in the movie The Graduate, which I'm sure we've all seen, the second half of the movie, Benjamin doesn't start chasing Elaine until the second half of the film. And when he's trying to get to the church where she's getting married, we're with him. We don't know what he's going to do. He gets into the church. He climbs up to that balcony and he looks down to see Elaine getting married. And that choice, that decision he makes there to either be like, oh well, I missed my chance, better luck next time, hope they're happy, and walks away, or what he does, which is to scream her name and pound on the glass and fight off everyone in the church and steal her away in this kind of strange act of kind of old-fashioned heroism in a way. And then we get the ironic ending when now they run off together in a bus and they're both sitting there in a beautiful scene of complete stillness, the sounds of silence playing, and there's kind of a sense of, okay, now what? We're going to end up just like our parents and their generation that's so messed up. So, you know, that's a really great scene. Okay, but I digress. He writes about where to put the crisis in the placement of the crisis. The location of the crisis is determined by the length of the climactic action. It could be the entire story. Like he uses Leaving Las Vegas for an example, where the character makes a decision that he wants to just kind of drink himself to death, and he goes to Las Vegas and he achieves his goal. And that's what the story is about. Crisis decision must be a deliberately static moment. This is the obligatory scene. Do not put it off screen or skim over it. The audience wants to suffer with the protagonist through the pain of this dilemma. He uses Thelma and Louise as an example of the crisis right before the climax, where they're Thelma and Louise are in the car, they're trapped between the edge of a cliff, literally into the Grand Canyon, and the police behind them, knowing that they're going to get arrested and all that's going to happen. And in that moment, one of them, I think it's Thelma, says, "Why don't we just keep going?" And they go for it. And that is a very famous ending. It's a very, very odd way to kind of resolve the story, but it worked, and it was tragic and kind of inspiring at the same time. I like that movie a lot. All right, so what else? Climax. Story climax is the fourth of the 5-part structure. The crowning major reversal is not necessarily full of noise and violence. Rather, it must be full of meaning. That's important to remember. Meaning produces emotion. Meaning, a revolution in values from positive to negative or negative to positive, with or without irony. A value swing at maximum charge that's absolute and irreversible. The meaning of that change moves the heart of the audience. And then he goes on with, the action that creates this change must be pure, clear, and self-evident, requiring no explanation. Dialogue or narration to spell it out is boring and redundant. I think a lot of the problems with Game of Thrones last season that everyone online was complaining about, and I agreed, was that it wasn't clear. It didn't make sense when Daenerys makes that critical decision, that crisis decision, to burn down King's Landing and all the people. And then people were like, well, you have to go back and look. It's like, no. If you have to go back and look, it didn't work. Something like that should be like all of the mines, the landmines have to be in place. And when they explode and they set off a chain reaction, it has to make perfect sense. And where you're like, oh, of course, that's all that she could have done in that moment. Because it's all been explained before, even if it's been explained in a way that we're not even aware of until it happens. I mean, that's really the magic moment. But Game of Thrones did not do that, and it was really disappointing. I mean, I still love the series, I still love the books, and I'm still working through them. I'm about 3/4 through A Feast for Crows right now, but they blew it on that one. The climax of the last act is your great imaginative leap. Without it, you have no story. Until you have it, your characters wait like suffering patients praying for a cure. Then an idea for the climax pops unsupported into the imagination. Now we must work backwards to support it in the fictional reality underlying the hows and whys. If you look at Game of Thrones and let's say the crisis is when Daenerys makes that decision to murder the people in King's Landing, and then Jon kills her would be the climax, and then the rest of the story about like what happens to everyone is the falling action, which is not a bad structure. And if that's, I don't know if this was confirmed, but apparently that was George R.R. Martin's design to have how this series would finish, that this would happen. But in order for it to make sense, especially the part with Daenerys, all of those ideas had to have been planted all along, and they just weren't. They just weren't. And when people are like, well, you know, she did do this, and she did burn the slavers and all this stuff, it's like, well, yeah, but nothing in her character would suggest that she would do what she did. And that's and saying, well, it's because she's crazy. That doesn't make sense. That's like, and then we woke up, it was all a dream. Here's a good quote. William Goldman argues that the key to all story endings is to give the audience what it wants, but not the way it expects. And then he also writes a little bit about the small percentage of audiences who won't see any film that has a negative ending. You know, that was always the thing in Hollywood. It's got to have a happy ending. If you've ever seen that movie, The Player, which is like a scathing rebuke of the Hollywood system and the whole thing about the happy ending, but apparently it's really true. I mean, I know people in my family who will never see a movie that has a negative ending because they don't want to be bummed out or something. And McKee has a good take on that, so just indulge me for a second. The reason for that is a small percentage of the audience won't go to any film that might give it an unpleasant experience. Generally, their excuse is that they've had enough tragedy in their lives. But if we were to look closely, we discover that that they not only avoid negative emotions in movies, they avoid them in life. Such people think that happiness means never suffering, so that they never feel anything deeply. The depth of our joy is in direct proportion to what we've suffered. So I think that does explain why some people don't like to see movies that are, that don't have like a happy ending. But I always love those downbeat endings, so I don't know. I guess I'm not the only one. Who determines which particular emotions will satisfy an audience at the end of the film or book? The writer. From the way he tells the story from the beginning, he whispers to the audience, expect an up ending, or expect a down ending, or expect irony. Having pledged a certain emotion, it is ruinous not to deliver. So we give the audience the experience we've promised, but not in the way it expects. That is what separates artist from amateur. Okay, that's pretty good. That's a pretty high goal to shoot for. And then the last part is resolution. The resolution, the fifth of the 5-part structure, is any material left after climax that has 3 possible uses. And he talks about making the most of that, that resolution. It doesn't just have to be a boring kind of montage that shows, what everyone's doing with their lives. It can have like a little twist. It can have a scene that calls back to the crisis. He talks about the one of my favorite comedies from the 70s, The In-Laws, does that. It's a kind of a happy ending. They got the money, they got away with it, and they're at the wedding, and then the FBI guy shows up, and it's like, oh my gosh, they're caught. No, not really. It's still a happy ending. Or the satiric title role in Animal House, which of course is great. And then his final word on resolution is, a film needs what the theater calls a slow curtain. A line of description at the bottom of the last page that sends the camera slowly back or tracking along images for a few seconds so the audience can catch its breath, gather its thoughts, and leave the cinema with dignity.
Hi, Lily.
So that is all I have for today with story. I'll be back when I get there with the next part, which is the writer at work, which deals with more of the mechanics of writing. So please let me know in the comments below if you have any insights or comments about this part of the story, the crisis, the climax, and the resolution. And if you agree with me about Game of Thrones, I'd be willing to be disputed on that one, but I do think that was a big part of the problem. So that is all I have for today. Thanks again for stopping by my haunted library, and I'll see you soon. Bye.